Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics, or SOGIESC, study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguards Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, and I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 16th thematic consultation topic so far. And this is the first in a series of regional consultations and discussions on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sexual characteristics. In today's session, we're joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Social Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, and also by Oliver Chapman, a Senior Social Development Specialist also within SDCC of the Asian Development Bank. We're also very fortunate to have with us Mr. Tony Joe Levos, a Senior Consultant on SOGIESC. Our moderator for this Q&A session is Hardy Yar-Dupuy, the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Social Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. Other experts will also be on hand for the moderated question and answer session from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. And I know they all look forward to engaging with you for the discussion, as well as responding to feedback. This is our first interactive consultation on the sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, and it builds on the previous sessions on gender and SEA that we had last week and the previous week. Today we have representation mostly from the Philippines, India, and Bangladesh, and a number of other countries in South and Southeast Asia, including also Nepal, Thailand, the United States, Vietnam, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Pakistan and Uzbekistan are also here with us today. A note that we will be extensive with our use of SOGIESC as an acronym in English to denote sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. We ask participants and simultaneous interpreters to take note of these acronyms. In this consultation, Oliver Chapman and Tony Joe Levos will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on SOGIESC and the relationship of this study to the gender and the SEA study presented last week, as they both pertain to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like you will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy, and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future revised policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining the meeting, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, ensuring that your microphone is off when not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked by Heidi R. Dupuy to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you wish, so that you can ask your question live. As we're all colleagues here, please be respectful to each other's point of views and each other. We will manage to keep time and ensure that we are within our schedule. and at any point during this consultation, IT support will be provided. You may ask for such support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages that we are using today. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available today in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu. To access simultaneous interpretations, please click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select the preferred language. Please don't forget to select the mute original audio button so that you can hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter clearly. For those listening in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu today, if you feel that any of us native English speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer the speaker to slow down, you can ask the original English speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is two reverse arrows pointing to your left in white. This will let us English speakers know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name as well as, if you prefer, your preferred pronouns in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name and pronoun on the Zoom screen, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, click on the Rename button, and then type in your name, the agency you represent, and your preferred pronoun, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the Smile icon or the Reaction button, and then click on the Raise Hand emoji. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. When invited to do so, to show your video if you prefer, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders, so let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I'm not going to read all the text on the slide, but just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed for and each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the Zoom screen or that's flashed on the PowerPoint presentation. If you have any issues or concerns regarding the recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through the email address that's flashed on the chat box or on the Zoom screen. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize our time as well as yours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks and provide a context for this study. Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Secondly, Mr. Oliver Chapman, a Senior Social Development Specialist, will provide a contextual overview of the SOGIESC study. Mr. Chapman is a Senior Social Development Specialist within a SDCC at the Asian Development Bank. Thirdly, a study methodology and its findings will be presented by Mr. Tony Joe Lebos, a senior consultant on SOGIESC, also consulting for the Asian Development Bank within the Social Development and Climate Change Department. We will then have a brief 5-minute break where I will offer insights and a brief summary of the presentations provided, and then request you to think about a questionnaire that will be delivered immediately following the Q&A session. Finally, when we return from the break, and as a culmination of the previous presentations, we will have an open discussion on the SOGIESC issues raised in the presentations, as well as a study summary that has been emailed to all pre-registered participants and continues to be available as a download from the various ADB websites, including the Safeguard Policy Update website. This will be facilitated and moderated by Heidi Dupuis of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. A reminder that you may also ask your questions in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu, and of course in English, in the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions. Heidi Dupuis will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversations for the discussions we will have. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn of the ADB to give us a wrap up and the next steps following this consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and the contextual overview of the SOGIESC study. Bruce, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azin. And good day, welcome, and thank you to all of the participants joining today for this regional consultation on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics, or SOGIESC, as you've heard from Azin. This session is intended to build on a series of consultations that ADB has been undertaking for the update of our Safeguard Policy Statement. I'll go into some details about that in a few moments, but as you've heard from Azin, we've been focusing over the last couple of weeks on gender issues. Firstly, we had a consultation broadly on gender and safeguards. Then last week, we held consultations on the topic of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, or SAYA for short. And then this week, we're focusing on sexual orientation, gender identities, gender expression and sexual characteristics, SOGIESC. So we're trying to take a comprehensive approach to understanding issues and getting views from various stakeholders. Now, for this session, we're focusing on consultations with civil society and non-government stakeholders, mostly from South Asia and Central and West Asia. But as you've heard from Azin, we also have a range of other stakeholders joining from different areas. Wherever you're joining from, though, we very much welcome your participation in this session, and we would really like to encourage everyone to share openly your views and your recommendations during this consultation session. It's very much important to us. Now, as some of you will be joining for perhaps the first time, let me provide some brief background as to why we're here with the update of ADB Safeguard Policy. For those of you that have joined previously, I apologize for covering some of the information again. We do just want to make sure that everyone has got a good background as to why these sessions are being organized. Okay, so firstly, ADB's current Safeguard Policy Statement was approved in 2009, and it's been under implementation since January 2010, so for more than a decade. The policy aims to ensure that the projects that ADB supports or finances do not lead to adverse impacts on the environment or people. And the key objective of the policy is to avoid, minimize, mitigate, or offset for adverse impacts on people and the environment, as well as building capacity of our developing member countries and clients to be able to implement the safeguards. So after more than 10 years, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, or the IED, prepared and completed a fairly comprehensive evaluation on the effectiveness of the existing policy. In fact, this was actually the third evaluation that they had done on the Safeguard Policy Statement, but this was perhaps the most comprehensive study. And Of the many recommendations that they did make, a key one was that ADB should update and modernize the policy. We should also look at strengthening our approach to country systems. Also, that we needed to provide more guidance on the policy and to address a number of key gaps that had emerged in the policy framework during the last decade. Of course, during that period, many issues have emerged, or our awareness of issues has been increased, and others, including our comparator organizations, other multilateral development banks, have updated their systems, their safeguard standards, and their implementation requirements. So, a key issue really for ADB is to look and learn from those and to update the policy, seeking, of course, harmonization with others, but really trying to see how we can implement international good practice that is appropriate for our operations in the region. Now, that evaluation study was completed in May 2020, and the ADB management endorsed all of the key recommendations from the independent evaluation. And then we launched, starting from August 2020, a process to then update the policy. For that process, we have been undertaking a series of analytical studies. We've been looking at a range of issues, including some of the maybe more traditional areas that the safeguards has covered, things like environment or involuntary resettlement or Indigenous people safeguards. But as we've been going through the process, we've been introducing a range of other more cross-cutting issues, including how do we strengthen stakeholder engagement? And then now, of course, over the last few weeks, we've been looking more closely at gender issues. Now, these studies are intended to give us an understanding of ADB's existing policy and how that compares against other multilateral financial institutions, as well as, of course, we've been looking at our own implementation experiences within the ADB. The presentations and studies that we've been preparing are published on the ADB website, and they feed into these regional consultations. That then allows us to get feedback from the general public and stakeholders on the studies and the directions for the safeguard policy. As a next step, we'll be soon concluding these regional consultations. We'll then be moving to a stage where we have further consultations in country with a range of our developing member countries and also civil society. And at the same time, we're starting to prepare a draft of the new ADB environmental and social policy and environmental and social standards, which will set out the requirements for our borrowers and clients in the future. We're expecting at this stage for the first draft of that policy to be available by about September or October this year. Now, coming to today's topic. So just a few things to mention before we move to the presentations, which will give further details. Firstly, SOGIESC has been an emerging issue for ADB, and we're looking forward to engaging with a range of experts from civil society and elsewhere to learn more. We're aware, of course, that there is stigma, discrimination, and violence that are real risks for people of different sexual orientation and gender, and that these issues have distinct effects on them that we need to consider. We need to work very carefully to look at how we should integrate risks that people from LGBTQI communities are facing. These are key issues that we need to consider. We need to make sure that for the wider community that we do no harm. We're also pleased that there is a good emerging practice from other multilateral financial institutions in this area, and this is something that we'd be seeking to understand and build on. And of course, there is growing collaboration between ADB and other multilateral financial institutions on the wider SOGIESC inclusion agenda. And this is important and necessary to provide a supportive framework for us to be able to explore these issues and take them forward in a practical and meaningful way. So just to say, there are two sides there. One is a proactive agenda, which ADB recognizes and supports and is keen to be able to take forward to strengthen inclusion and strengthen awareness. And then secondly, in the context of our safeguards, we do need to take an approach that seeks to do no harm, to understand and to address risks in the context of projects that we may finance. So with that context, let me now thank you again for joining us very much for this session. We're looking forward, as I said, to hearing your views openly and in a safe environment in this session. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Oliver Chapman, who is going to spend some more time to set the scene. So thank you. Over to you, Oliver.
Thanks very much, Bruce. So I'm going to start the presentation by setting the scene with some synthesized knowledge on SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific. You may have heard some of this material before, but please bear in mind also that this needs to be accessible to our various stakeholders, including governments and other clients who may be new to the topic. Next slide, please. So we first wanted to get to set the scene about SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific. So evidence suggests that sexual and gender minorities constitute a vulnerable population in the region as they continue to face widespread stigma, discrimination, and violence in many of ADB's developing member countries. The history of the region shows rich diversity of SOGIESC, including transgender Babaylan shamans of pre-colonial Philippines and the third gender Hijra throughout South Asia, as well as many other equivalents. Partly due to colonial influences, third gender cultural institutions were undermined and sodomy was criminalized in many countries. Although restrictive laws remain in some countries, some have more recently made or considered legal reforms to support more inclusive approaches to inclusion on the basis of sexuality and gender identity. Today, there are a complex array of laws and regulations that influence inclusion on the basis of SOGIESC, both positively and negatively. And a thriving civil society sector operating at both national and regional levels has in recent years been campaigning for liberalization of laws, social attitude change, enhanced service provision, and inclusive approaches in the private sector. Next slide, please. So now on to the key risks, which Bruce mentioned. Sexual and gender minorities, by virtue of their SOGIESC, may be more likely to be adversely affected by project impacts or more constrained than others in their ability to take advantage of project benefits. This is because of cross-cutting and cross-sectoral risk factors, including discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV. So on discrimination, discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC can be direct or indirect. It means creating a distinction, exclusion, or restriction which has the purpose or effect of impairing or excluding a person based on their real or perceived SOGIESC. It affects project benefits, negative impacts, and the opportunity to voice comments or concerns during stakeholder engagement and in grievance redress mechanisms. And on SGBV, sexual and gender minorities are at an elevated risk of SGBV. They often lack the necessary mechanisms to seek justice due to legal and social contexts. These risks are caused and magnified by both social stigma and lack of legal rights in many contexts. Next slide, please. And we looked at various studies, especially from the Asia-Pacific region in terms of our regional context. So in a study conducted in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam by UNDP, Curtin University, and the Asia-Pacific Transgender Network, it was found that cisgender individuals, so that's non-transgender people, were 54.5% more likely to be invited to a job interview when compared to transgender individuals having equivalent employment profiles. And a study by ILO and UNDP conducted in China, Philippines, and Thailand found that sexual and gender minorities face firstly limited legal protections from discrimination in the workplace. Second, they often face negative or unequal treatment. And thirdly, have little recourse to, or remedy to mistreatment and discrimination. And the final one that two more. Next, there are lingering negative beliefs and attitudes towards sexual and gender minorities across multiple sectors. And that was looked at health, education and employment. And that was a study by UNDP in Thailand. And finally, the World Bank has done a preliminary assessment that sexual and gender minorities are likely overrepresented in the bottom 40% of the population in terms of real per capita income. Next slide, please. Based on the work of Lee Badgett at Massachusetts University Amherst, amongst others, there's evidence of causality linking SOGIESC inclusion to economic and social development. And the literature shows 4 primary drivers of this. Firstly, lower productivity from discrimination in the workplace, where there is exclusion, lower returns on education and training, lost output from health disparities, and an inefficient expenditure on social and health services due to the effects of unequal treatment. And these effects, or the reason why we really look at that, is reinforced by the assessment that a far greater number of people are from diverse SOGIESC than is often imagined. And current assessments are that it's between 5 and 20% of the population. So next slide, please. ADB and the World Bank are collaborating on a study on the legal barriers faced by sexual and gender minorities. And I think many of you at this consultation have already been supporting us with that. So thank you very much. And why are we doing this study? That's because we feel that legal barriers are foundational. They are specifically challenging for LGBTQI people across Asia Pacific and globally, and potentially even more so than for other groups. And they're highly relevant for both safeguards and aspirational type development work. So our study differs from various other studies in 2 main ways. Firstly, it is operationally relevant for multilateral development banks, so the business that we're in. And secondly, it's highly detailed, which means we can find nuanced findings looking at specific issues, and how they could be operationalized. So we have 165 data points across 6 domains, and the domains are criminalization, access to inclusive education, access to the labor market, access to public services, civil and political inclusion, and protection from hate crimes. And we are partway through the data collection, but at a high level, the emerging issues are that people with diverse SOGIESC are facing legal discrimination in all sectors and in all countries, but that some progress is being made in a handful of countries in terms of our sample in Asia and the Pacific, on partnership rights and on anti-discrimination provisions. And currently only Nepal from our sample is collecting data on non-cisgender people as part of its census. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Tony Joe, I just wanted to give a quick overview of some of the issues we've already been hearing from civil society about. And of course, this is not to restrict us in any way. This is just a starting point, but just to let you know. First, we've picked up that, which is in line with what I've been talking about up to now, there is evidence of diminished economic, social and legal status of sexual and gender minorities, which has an impact on safeguards. There are specific risk factors of the stigma, discrimination and violence. And also that gender norms are really critical in the way that they impact on these risk factors. There is globally and regionally a lack of good data disaggregation, and this has a real effect on policy and programs. Then the topic of how can we improve our social impact assessments and action plans to specifically mitigate the risks for people with diverse SOGIESC. Next, the importance of intersectionality, which, as many of you know, is about multiple intersecting factors that increase vulnerability and exclusion. Next, the need for capacity building of both ADB and governments on the topic of SOGIESC inclusion. The need to address how to carry out meaningful consultations with LGBTQI people, considering the lack of visibility and also stigma and discrimination. Specific vulnerabilities in issues such as labor and resettlement, where people from diverse SOGIESC can have real barriers in terms of the sorts of projects that we work on. And finally, the proposal from some civil society organizations for a standalone standard within our framework on gender equality and SOGIESC. So those are some of the issues we've already been hearing about from you all, and looking forward to hearing more. And I'll now hand over to Tony Joe to talk about the benchmarking study we've been doing on the comparator MFIs. Over to you, Tony Joe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Joe Labos, and I am a consultant who has been advising the ADB team in their review of the SPS in relation to SOGIESC. In this section of the presentation, I will talk briefly about a benchmarking study we've conducted and its main findings. So Oliver and Bruce already did a tremendous job setting up the context of the study, so I will not spend any time repeating what they said. Instead, I will shift directly to talking about the objectives of the study, which were twofold. First, the first objective is to better understand some good practice on SOGIESC inclusion in ADB DMCs and in international development. This includes understanding SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific, challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities in the region, and more broadly, the linkages between SOGIESC and economic development. The second purpose is to compare ADB's current policies, strategies, and practices on SOGIESC and policies and approaches to those used by peer MFIs. This second objective includes summarizing ADB's coverage of SOGIESC under existing policies and conducting a benchmarking of other MFIs and their policies towards SOGIESC. So my presentation will focus primarily on the findings of the study, particularly as it relates to the second objective. Next slide, please. So to start with, how is SOGIESC already included in some of ADB's current policies and strategies? So ADB's Strategy 2030, Operational Priority 1 on addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities, recognizes sexual orientation as one of the social aspects that often undermine people's participation, voice, rights, and access to resources and services. Similarly, Operational Priority 2, Accelerating Progress in Gender Equality, requires DMCs to address discrimination against disadvantages for women, including those related to class, ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation and gender identity, disability, religion, age, and migration. Also, while ADB's Operation Manual section C3BP on incorporation of social dimensions in ADB operations makes no explicit reference to SOGIESC issues, it does list social elements such as gender, ethnicity, race, caste, age, and others that may influence people's decision-making, access to services, resources, and opportunities, as well as the ability to cope with risks. ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement of 2009 aims to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse environmental and social impacts, including protecting the rights of those likely to be affected or marginalized by the development process. So although the SPS does not explicitly mention the risks to SOGIESC people, it does not exclude either. So the SPS mentions that as part of the social impact assessment, it will identify individuals and groups who may be differently or disproportionately affected by the project because of their disadvantages or their vulnerable status. Furthermore, the SPS, under meaningful consultation, also requires the process to be gender inclusive and responsive and tailored to the needs of disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. Now, moving on to the benchmarking analysis. The benchmarking analysis basically compares SOGIESC-related policies, standards, and resources present in comparator MFIs. So MFI stands for Multilateral Financial Institutions. The recently updated MFI safeguard frameworks are using different approaches to tackle SOGIESC in their operations. So some MFIs have incorporated explicit provisions in their safeguard standards, and others have developed tools, procedures, and good practice notes that can be used during project design and implementation by both staff and borrowers. So the benchmarking analysis is conducted basically on three main criteria. So the first criteria that we use is that what does the inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI policies and standards look like? The second criteria is the presence of operational SOGIESC related guidance material for staff and clients, for example, guidance notes or good practice notes. And then the last criteria is the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC-related support within the institution. So I'm going to start with the first criteria, which is the inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI safeguard policies and standards. We find that ADB's SPS does not have explicit reference to SOGIESC. So there is no specific SOGIESC related safeguard standard or policies in place that mandates the protection of sexual and gender minorities in ADB projects. Among the comparator MFIs, so the AIIB, which stands for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, their revised environmental and social framework specified its enhanced commitment to gender equality without explicit reference to sexual and gender minorities. Similarly, the World Bank did not make explicit reference to SOGIESC issues in the main body of its environmental and social framework, which they refer to as the ESF, but provide coverage for sexual and gender minorities as a category of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups under its directive on addressing risks and impacts on disadvantaged and vulnerable individuals or groups. The EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, explicitly refer to sexual and gender minorities as vulnerable groups. The IFC, which is International Finance Corporations, the EBRD and the IDB also include SOGIESC as potential discriminatory grounds in employment under the requirement for labor and working conditions. Furthermore, IDB's environmental and social policy also stresses the need for clients to identify and address risks, impact, and access to opportunities that may disproportionately affect people because of their disadvantage or vulnerable statuses, including sexual and gender minorities. It also requires the borrowers to provide special measures of protection and assistance to address the vulnerabilities of project workers, including people with diverse SOGIESC, and address measures to prevent and address violence, harassment, intimidation, and or exploitation. It also includes provisions to take into account concerns of sexual and gender minorities through the stakeholder engagement process in determining priority services and engaging throughout the project lifecycle through meaningful consultation. Notably from all of these, the IDB's ESP has more explicit and specific coverage of SOGIESC issues overall. Next slide, please. So under the second criteria, which again is relating to the presence of operational SOGIESC-related guidance material for staff and clients, we find that among the MFIs, ADB, the AIIB, the IFC, and the EBRD and the IDB have not published SOGIESC-specific guidance material for the implementation of their respective safeguard frameworks. The World Bank, on the other hand, has developed a good practice note on non-discrimination based on SOGI to support ESF implementation. The good practice note guides thinking around SOGIESC issues in development projects and structures implementation support for the borrower in addressing the risks of discrimination. So in the good practice note, non-discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC is set out at different stages of the project life cycle, including scoping, assessment, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and meaningful stakeholder engagements. Other MFIs, such as the IDB, have worked and contributed to SOGIESC-specific research IFC has published an emerging practice report that elaborates on good practice for advancing the economic inclusion of sexual and gender minorities. And the CWRD has also published various SOGIESC related research studies. Next slide, please. Lastly, under the third criteria relating to the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC related support, we find that the AIIB, the EBRD, and the IDB do not have full-time staff exclusively working on SOGIESC, but hire consultants on an ad hoc basis for support on SOGIESC specific tasks. While there are no full-time staff solely focused on SOGIESC issues at the ADB, staff at the institutions have supported SOGIESC-related tasks at the request of certain clients. The ADB also hires consultants to support on SOGIESC-specific issues. Lastly, the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the IFC leads on support for SOGIESC matters in the institution. So staff at the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group typically focus on a set of topics, including gender, SOGIESC, and disability. The World Bank has a global advisor on SOGI, supported by a full-time social development analyst and a small team of consultants. Their work supports World Bank teams in their proactive agenda on SOGIESC inclusion in projects, and support project teams in designing, implementing, and monitoring projects in accordance to their environmental and social framework. So some key tasks for the advisor include the inclusion of SOGIESC issues in country partnership frameworks, and undertaking strategic country diagnostics to generate data and analytics related to SOGIESC. Another task includes capacity building for World Bank staff in headquarters and in country offices on SOGI and inclusive development. The capacity building to project task team leaders on ESF requirements in relation to SOGI. And lastly, providing resources and tools to project teams and clients to address SOGIESC issues within safeguards, and providing guidance and advice to senior management when it comes to challenging contexts when it comes to SOGIESC. Next slide, please. So based on the study analysis, some issues for further consideration in the SPS review and update include, first of all, the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities as a category under the definition of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. So secondly, the incorporation of SOGIESC specific provisions in the revised policy and borrowers' requirements on issues such as labor standards and resettlement. The preparation of tools, guidance notes for screening, scoping, implementation, and monitoring of SOGIESC measures in accordance with the revised SPS. Another issue that arises is ensuring adequate SOGIESC specific resources and staffing at the ADB for the implementation and monitoring of SOGIESC issues in accordance to the revised SPS. Providing capacity building on non-discrimination based on SOGIESC to ADB staff and projects executing and implementing agencies. And lastly, engaging in regional SOGIESC specific knowledge generation through partnership with other international organizations and civil society organizations which operate at the regional and country levels. So I will stop my part of the presentation here and hand it back to Azim to introduce the moderated discussion part of the consultation. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tony Joe, and to all three of our presenters. Thank you again. Thanks, Oliver Chapman, to you, Tony Joe Lebos, and of course, Bruce Dunn, for all of your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and for the overviews on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics issues that you have raised for all of us to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's IED publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March 2023. The comparative analyses on SOGIESC presented by Tony Joe will need to be considered in how the ADB becomes a leader in incorporating SOGIESC issues in the revised safeguards policy. Of particular interest are the benchmarks and alignment and the analysis of the comparator MFIs to SOGIESC and how the ADB strategy 2030 and OP1 and OP2 specifically, as well as CB33 from the operations manual, needs to be inclusive and mainstreamed, as Tony Jo Lebos mentioned. We hope we can get to feedback and an opportunity to delve into some of these issues during the discussions arising from the Q&A sessions. And we hope that the ADB considers these policy topics and areas during this facilitated Q&A session. This session is going to run for between 70 to 80 minutes or so, but there is, of course, some flexibility in that. Just to note that as you're thinking about the questions and the interventions you wish to raise, should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, you can always do so by sending the message in the chat box. But instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please just select sending the message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, who are members of our team working behind the scenes. They will then repost your question under their name, offering you anonymity and an opportunity to have your identity protected. So just to think about that as we head into our break. But for now, we're going to pause for 5 minutes. The next set of slides will have our guide questions up on the screen. Thank you very much. And those will remain on the screen during the break. I want to request stakeholders to also think about how effective this particular consultation is and whether or not it met and responded to your needs and addressed your issues in a very comprehensive way. There will be a number of links to surveys that we will be undertaking, 2 of which will be online and 1 of which will be live here during the consultation. The online ones are a post-event questionnaire, as well as another one on menti.com, which will allow you to provide specific feedback in 5, 6, 7 sentences and give you about 24 to 28 hours to respond. So there's no urgency to that, but the live one, which is a Zoom poll, will be undertaken in about 2 to 3 minutes. So please join us for a Q&A session facilitated by Heidi Dupuy after the break. You will see on the top right-hand side of the screen a 5-minute countdown timer. You will note that as that countdown timer approaches 0, we're about to restart the consultations. And should you happen to be moving away from your screen for a stretch or getting a coffee, some background music will be playing. As that background music begins to fade, you will also know that it's time to return to your screen. So with that, we will leave you and look forward to welcoming you back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Enjoy the break. Thanks very much, everybody, and welcome back. We will now have the Q&A discussions as facilitated by Heidi Eer-Dupuis, who is head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. You will continue to see some guide questions flashed on the screen, which we also had during our break, but please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve SOGIESC issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement and better align it to ADB Strategy 2030 and OP1 and OP2, as well as CB33 from the Operations Manual, which Oliver Chapman and Tony Joe Lebos mentioned. A reminder that you can ask your questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in Zoom by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen in either English, Hindi, Russian, or Urdu. And a further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send your comment message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select sending the message to only Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino. And these are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question or comment under their own name, offering you anonymity and protecting your identity. After the Q&A session, we will have a quick event evaluation and a number of other links to questionnaires before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and indicative next steps. So with that, please allow me to turn you over to Heidi Eer-Dupuis of the Asian Development Bank. Heidi, if you please.
Thank you, Asim. So please be reminded of the questions that we posted earlier. If you have any points of discussion based on these 5 questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat box here, and we will pick up on your questions and we will direct them to the right person to answer your questions. I see that there's a comment in the chat box. Can we call on, I think it's can we call on Yaya Ayemayat to please make your interesting comments out loud to share with us? Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Very clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I am originally from Myanmar, and then I have been a kind of like gender activist in my country, and then back in 2020, prior to 2020, this was like around 2019, I had kind of like this experience with one of the vendors from the ADB, and then I have reported the case. So I have listed down the case number as well, and then I think that the details can be looked at back there. So what happened is that I reported the case, but then it took like some times, and then like I received the responses. However, the responses is kind of like very vague, and then I at that time I did not feel happy about it, and then my intention was not to kind of like name and shame the person, but kind of like to reinforce the procedures and how things are being done when it comes to this kind of cyber bullies or anything like as to like do no harm policy of which most organizations have. So, but then I could not follow up on this after the responses from the director of the Office of Professional Conduct, because we had the general elections, and after that we also kind of like had the coup, and following that I had to run away from my home. So after almost like 2 years, I could not do anything about this. But then again, today I had seen that like ADB is trying to work so hard, and then I'm very glad about that. This is the reason why I came here and then listened to the presentation. And then I've seen that like, well, in most circumstances in the past, there were a lot of needs. So I think that my case would have been in this, so that it was not properly addressed. But then I believe that in the future, with the improvement, things could be better for everyone where ADB is serving. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. This is a very, very important issue you raised, and I'd like to direct it to our Director of Safeguard, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to perhaps make a comment in general on how we address complaints or issues raised by project-related stakeholders in our grievance redress mechanism and our safeguard policy. Over to you, Bruce.
So yeah, thank you very much. It's Yaya Aymayat. Apologies if I have the wrong pronunciation for your name, but I very much appreciate you joining today and sharing that personal experience. It's very important for us to be able to hear that and to be able to learn from those experiences. I'm not aware of the individual circumstances. You've provided some information in the chat, which we'll be able to look at. So I won't be able to speak to the specific details, but I apologize that you weren't able to receive at that time a response that you found satisfactory. So of course, if there's anything that you would like to share with us offline privately to allow further follow-up, that's something that we'd be very happy to do. I just want to speak a little bit more broadly. We're in a stage now where we're seeking to move forward lessons learned from the past, also understanding good practices and how other institutions have been able to develop their own policies so that we can put in place stronger provisions for the future. We recognize actually that we need to strengthen actually across the board grievance redress mechanisms in our projects. And that's something that we've been discussing quite carefully through these consultations. We did have a specific consultation actually on stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation and grievance redress processes. And this was something that came out very clearly, the need to strengthen those processes, but then also the need to customize and tailor those to different project circumstances, of course, the country, the local cultural context, the language, the community that you're working with, but also for gender issues and for recognition of various sexual orientation and gender identity issues, bringing those into the framework, making sure that it's a sensitive approach, as well as for sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, a whole range of very sensitive issues that have to be addressed carefully through those processes. And also, of course, at various different levels to be able to address the concerns of people. So I'm very keen and concerned that we learn the lessons appropriately from the past. Perhaps one of my colleagues may like to elaborate a little further on some of the things that we are considering, because right now, for example, ADB, as we discussed this actually last week in a consultation on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, we've developed a good practice note, which we're working towards finalizing, and then to be able to implement that in a pilot phase, and then later we'll be able to bring that into the policy. So there's a number of things that we are currently considering to see how we can strengthen that process. But again, thank you for joining and for sharing those thoughts. And if we can, continue to discuss any issues, we're happy to take that up on a side track. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for the answer, and thank you, Yaya, for raising the very, very important issues, and thank you for speaking up on this issue. We really appreciate it, and also for your participation here today to share with us. Next, we have Ravi Verma, who would like to make a comment. Go ahead, Ravi.
Thank you. Thank you so much to give me this opportunity. My name is Ravi Verma, and I work with the International Center for Research on Women in the India office, which is the Asia branch of the ICRW headquartered in Washington, DC. Great to be part of this consultation on gender and SOGIEC. At ICRW, we are committed to building evidence towards gender equity and social inclusion. We have a strong presence here in Asia with our regional office based out of New Delhi, and we have worked along with partners along several countries in the region on different thematic areas, including women's economic empowerment, youth development, sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, among many others. We are also working with ADB South Asia on some very interesting and much needed research around the role of male engagement in supporting gender equity and women's empowerment in these sectors. We are very happy that we have had this opportunity and we are doing this, a stock taking of laws, policies, and programs across the 6 countries to identify entry points for ADB member countries to strengthen their work around gender equity and inclusion. It is quite exciting to see that ADB is reviewing the safeguard policy, which has a critical role to play in prevention and mitigation of risk that may pose barriers to equity and inclusion. Our research at ICRW, along with our partners, UNDP and others across 7 South Asian countries, APCOM, has shown that although there is greater recognition of these issues, there is a long way to go to creating awareness about SOGIESC and creating changes around social norms and stigma, violence, access to resources and opportunities, and legal rights and provision, and important to all, the capacities to deal with this. This is the reason why ICRW would encourage and support the ADB in adopting a strong, standalone SOGIESC safeguard to further strengthen the work and commitment towards sustainability and inclusion. I also think that there is a need for much greater research on understanding the contextual vulnerabilities and community-specific, project and sector-specific vulnerabilities to unfold how some of these violences and discriminations find their manifestations. ICRW will be very happy to work with ADB on new pieces of research if that comes to be doing. So thank you very much. And I congratulate ADB for taking this initiative further. I wish you all very best.
Thank you, Ravi. So the call for more research needed to be done at the country level and sector-specific vulnerabilities and potential for collaboration. So I turn it to Director Bruce Dunn for any comments, and perhaps maybe Madhu can come in after to share a little bit on the sector vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Ravi Verma. Really appreciated you joining today. Number of good points that you've made there, and certainly the need to understand contextual vulnerabilities is a key issue that we're aware of. In fact, something that's been coming up a lot through this consultation process is the need for us to strengthen sort of a contextual analysis, understanding the situation in the countries and the projects that we work with more comprehensively. Of course, there are a range of issues that occur, conflict and fragility being one of them in the situation, ethnicity, a whole range of issues that need to come into the fore there. Also, of course, intersectionality. This is something that was mentioned also during the presentation, the relationships, for example, between poverty and sexual orientation, gender identity issues, disability, children's rights issues as well. All of these topics have been coming up very much in the consultation, and we're trying to look at how we can strengthen a more integrated approach and an approach that looks at the intersectionality issues in the new framework. So I appreciate your recommendations and be very much keen to look at partnerships think this is an area that is evolving, and we see actually my colleagues, Madhumita Gupta, Oliver Chapman, for example, may wish to come into this after. Data is something that's very much lacking in the region. And we've been having to sort of rely on a handful of published studies and global studies, but not so much available at a country or regional level. And that's a gap that we need to fill if we're able to move forward effectively. So of course, Oliver has presented on some of the work that we're doing, but there will still be a lot more to be done in that space. Sector-specific vulnerabilities also, of course, there will be many issues in different sectors. We do a lot of work in infrastructure sectors. So of course, infrastructure presents a range of different risks, but that can of course be very different in context. For example, the construction of a road project, a long and linear intervention, which will have impacts to many people across a wide geographic scope, can be quite different from a project that can be centered for a long period of time in one location during the construction period. So, you know, there's a range of issues. But I would invite my colleagues to speak more on some of these issues because they're very important for this topic. So thank you.
I can jump in. I don't know if Madhu wants to say anything, but I'll just jump in quickly on a couple of things to add to what Bruce was saying. I think one of the things which I think you've been working with, you were saying yourself, was around the collaboration with the South Asia regional department. And I think you'll be well aware then that they've been doing the work on gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI. And I think one really key learning from that work is that by taking an integrated approach with lots of various vulnerabilities, you're able to get that a little bit deeper, I think, because you can sort of address some of the stigma, or at least find a way around some of the stigma, so you're able to get data in this kind of situation. So I think that's potentially a really strong direction. Another thing I would highlight is, I think, as you said as well, is that the potential of the partnerships that we have with civil society organizations, the UN, other MDBs. I think in collaboration, there's a lot more that we can do, especially in these kind of some of these high-risk sectors. And I think, you know, taking a kind of a localized and sector-specific approach enables us to learn a lot, and then from there I can see us making progress. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a long way to go in terms of the data gaps. I'm not sure that we're going to have kind of whole population-wide data for a little while to come, but I think we shouldn't necessarily just wait for that before we can make progress, because we can make a lot of progress. Madhu, sorry, did you want to add anything?
Not, I mean, I would just like to focus on, you know, some of the aspects in the ways in which we are trying to, you know, we are visualizing the revised policy. I think that would be a little useful in this context, because as you know, in one of our recommendations for the paper, we have said inclusion of sexual and gender minorities under the definition of vulnerable groups. If you look at our current SPS, it has a very broad definition without very specific reference to different groups. Now, that has both advantages and disadvantages. Advantages, you can be very flexible. The disadvantage may be that, you know, some population groups might be excluded during the assessment. Now, if you look at the structure of any safeguard policy, we have some key steps in any project-specific context. It starts with a screening process, followed by a scoping process, then by a social impact assessment. And from that social impact assessment, one would prepare mitigation plans. So in this entire structure of project cycle, and the mitigation plan is then implemented, monitored. So in this entire cycle, how are we thinking of actually inclusion of SOGIESC issues? It should start at the level of screening, you know, and that's where your you know, explanation about the legal framework of the country, the weak legal framework, protection measures, that is very important, the contextual risk assessment. At the screening stage, we are also trying to go a little deeper than before in our revised policy. We will assess the physical impacts, who are impacted. What are the contextual risk factors, meaning if the project is sited in a particular country, in a geographical area, what are the key issues over there? Who are the vulnerable groups? If there are people with diverse SOGIESC issues, what kind of stigma or criminalization they face? Now, this information may be generated through, as you said, collaboration with the CSOs, NGOs, international NGOs who are already working in that sector. And another main issue is also identification of the population group. Okay, I'm sorry, the interpreter, we could hear the interpreter over there. So all of these factors, will be considered at the screening stage of the contextual risk. What is the risk of the project? Based on that, one would have a social impact assessment, the kind of impacts it will have, and also design the stakeholder engagement process. How do we include them in the consultation process? All of that would feed into the preparation of a mitigation plan, and what kind of grievance mechanisms we need, what kind of, and the provisions for grievance mechanism that consider, issues of SOGIESC issues, SOGIESC concerns, which might be very different than from the mainstream, and as well as monitoring of those. So this is how we are thinking of, in terms of the policy coverage, but this also has to be, as you rightly said, followed up by very good detailed guidance and also training in-house as well as externally for both our executing agencies and implementing agencies. I will stop there. Thank you. Over to you, Heidi.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi, for raising the issues of the work that you do and following up and maybe keeping in contact on future work. So next we have Ryan Severio. Ryan, go ahead, please.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Ryan. I'm based in Manila in the Philippines. I work with ASEAN SOGI Caucus, which is a regional LGBTI human rights organization working in 11 countries in Southeast Asia. My interest around the safeguards is how we can leverage on this as part of a broader system of strengthening the human rights infrastructure globally. For example, we do understand that many LGBTI groups engage with the UN human rights system, for example, submitting alternative reports, generating recommendations, etc. I was thinking how we can leverage on the safeguards to be able to maximize the inputs from the UN human rights systems in appraising development projects that are being applied through the ADB. That's the first point. The second point is with regards to strengthening stakeholder engagement. There's a lot of LGBTI and human rights organizations based in countries where ADB does work with. Is there a potential mechanism where groups like us to submit information or alternative analysis or assessment with regards to development projects? I'm trying to think around the UN system. Say, for example, when a country is being reviewed, NGOs can also submit shadow or alternative reports. Can we have this mechanism side by side with the implementation of the safeguards? The third point I'd like to raise is with regards how the governments would react to potential perspective that the safeguards is more like a development imposition with regards to their domestic contexts. In Southeast Asia, a lot of governments really resist on SOGIESC and looking at it as a Western influence. Is there a potential way forward, just in case, say, for the government, say, I'm just thinking like Brunei or Malaysia would say no to particular conditionality? Up to what extent would ADB really take on a strong ground in putting forward SOGIESC as part of the guidelines? Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Ryan. You actually gave us a lot to think about. Really, three very important points. I think I'm going to, the first one is looking at globally leveraging safeguards to strengthen the human rights system and maybe offered more protection for vulnerable people. And then the second one is strengthening stakeholders' engagement and ways to submit perhaps some kind of analysis or report similar to the UN shadow reporting. I'm familiar about those reporting. Yeah, it's very interesting that civil society get to submit something on the side in addition to what government submit. And then the third area is how government react to potential development issues and what are some of the ways to strengthen the work and be able to move forward despite sometimes we may face obstacles and resistance. So these are some really in-depth challenging questions for our colleagues to think of. I think I would turn to the expert, I think Tony Joe first, because he's the researcher with the expert in this area. He may be able to shed some light on some of the work that's been done in this space. So and then we'll go to Bruce and Oliver and perhaps see if our colleagues Madhu also have any input. So thank you. I'll turn to Tony Joe first, our expert. Thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. So these are very important questions and they're very significant ones. So I'll try to answer some of them the best way I can and from my understanding of the question. So the first one is relating to how this can advance kind of global human rights movement. I think the integration of SOGIESC within frameworks for multilateral financial institutions is kind of I would see it as parallel to the human rights approach. It is kind of complementary in a way, but it's also parallel because it has kind of a different perspective towards the issue, which is really focused on economic development, societal development, and social inclusion. So while I can see that as just kind of complementing the human rights and the right thing to do kind of approach towards SOGIESC inclusion globally. The second thing that it adds absolutely is, again, related to data generation. Part of the, any kind of integration of safeguards will require understanding the issues that are faced by the community. And understanding the issues that are faced by the community requires data generation and whether quantitative or qualitative. So that will definitely advance, things for LGBTI human rights broadly and globally. The other question that I can probably address, and I'll just jump in here, relates to, context that might be challenging towards SOGIESC and how potentially frameworks can, I guess, like clients might not be in line with such frameworks. I cannot speak to really what the ADB has done, but I can speak from the World Bank perspective because I have worked with the World Bank and we have faced a lot of these issues because the World Bank ESF covers all countries and that includes many countries, unfortunately, that still criminalize LGBTI people. Or that are actually working on further criminalizing, sexual and gender minorities. So the approach that the World Bank has taken on these issues is that, first of all, the ESF for the World Bank has been approved by the board, by the board of directors. And so there's an argument that, once something is approved, it is the policy of the multilateral financial institutions, and each country is represented on there. So in a way, the country that is borrowing money from the World Bank has agreed to those terms when they have, accepted the ESF. So there is that approach that you can have with the client, saying that, this is something that has been agreed on by everyone at the executive board level. Another approach is really to kind of have that discussion. I know the World Bank has has some guidance on these issues, especially for countries that are going further with criminalization. So I think the ADB can learn a lot from these experiences and as they work through potentially integrating SOGIESC kind of integration just generally in their SPS review. So I'll just stop here and I'm happy to take on more questions.
Yes, thank you, Tony Joe. I'll turn over to Bruce now to answer the ADB specific and with respect to human rights and the safeguards as well. Go ahead, Bruce.
Great. So thank you very much, Ryan, for joining the consultation today, and of course, joining with the support for the ASEAN SOGI Coalition. A couple of things I wanted to just follow on from Tony Joe on the important issues that you raised. I'll start with the direction. So firstly, you've heard from the presentation, the section that my colleague Oliver had presented on, that increasingly there is the recognition for inclusion and equality in ADB's support for countries in the region, including for people of different sexual orientation and gender identity. So, there is that direction moving forward from ADB. Then in the context of the safeguards, so we're doing these background studies, we're holding these consultations with the intention to try and move this agenda forward in the context of the safeguards. But of course, I think as your question is sort of suggesting, it is a process where, of course, we need to move forward and be able to, not only push the agenda, but be able to implement effectively in the countries that we work. So as we're still in this process, what we're seeking to do now is to get inputs from a range of stakeholders, and we will also be talking to our developing member countries to understand their feedback as well. And then we'll have to try and move something forward at our board level for approval. As Tony Joe had mentioned just then, of course, we can get this forward in the policy framework. That then gives us a basis for including it as a provision, as a condition for ADB financing. But of course, we do have to be quite cognizant of the practical challenges for implementation, particularly in those countries where legal barriers may exist. And that's something I think we'll have to do quite a lot of further work on in terms of preparation of awareness raising materials, guidance, working with our countries upstream. So it's still, honestly, still quite a bit of way to go, but it's a direction that we're trying to take forward. Second, on the human rights system and approach. So we are looking at the context of human rights as we update the safeguard policy. As Tony Joe had mentioned, the safeguards are somewhat complementary to human rights, but also somewhat parallel. We are looking at human rights in the context of a couple of ways. One is that we'd like to make sure that key human rights issues that are relevant to the safeguards are integrated explicitly in considerations. So, clear requirements that relate to human rights issues that we can set forward as requirements then for our borrowers to implement against. But in addition to that, we are, as we've said before, looking to have a contextual risk analysis for all of our projects. Madhumita Gupta just spoke to that before. This contextual risk analysis would be a screening and review process that we would do for all projects, but it would have to be informed by the understanding of the country situation as well as the project context. And so that gives us then the opportunity to have partnerships and collaborations with UN agencies like the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights to be able to review reports that are prepared to understand that country context, and of course to take into consideration shadow reports that are prepared that then can provide that context and information as we start to prepare a project. So I think there are a number of things that we can do, particularly as we establish a policy framework that gives us more of a solid basis to go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Next, we have Midnight, who asked the question, when is the opportunity for engaging further on LGBTQ in the region? And Midnight also asked about the annual meeting in Sri Lanka. Is this still going to happen or not, and whether that's an opportunity to engage on the topic as well? Do you have any other questions to add to this comment, Midnight? Did I cover everything of the questions that you've asked?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Heidi. I'll send through some of the recommendations that we conducted at the regional level with CSOs of LGBT from Asia Pacific region. So I don't want to take much of the other people's time. So I'll post that in the chat box for recommendations. But what I would like to find out is really about how civil society groups at country level can engage with the ADB at country to do this kind of consultation in the local language, in local contexts. And as Ryan mentioned, the issues on LGBTQI particularly can be quite sensitive for some of the territories that we're working in. And so we're looking at opportunities to do some of the advocacy engagements on evidence building and bringing the voices of civil society groups to those that might not have a chance to actually speak to us directly. I know that this is one of the process, but I think we could also open those spaces up until the finalization of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Midnight. Bruce, can you share a little bit more about the opportunities to engage and provide input during the safeguard process? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Midnight, for joining. Let me elaborate a little bit further, and Oliver might also like to come in on the issue of further work around data gathering and studies. For the consultation process, we've been doing these regional consultations, which are more intended to be wider, open public forums covering all countries in the region. And we do have some translation available, but obviously it's not full coverage. In the next stage, we are actually planning initially to do follow-up consultations in 10 countries, and they will be less of this virtual format, more in-country missions, where we'll be meeting with government, having consultations with our government executing agencies and ministries that we work with. But in addition, in each of those countries, we'll organise civil society consultations, which would be broad and we hope also inclusive. And we're looking at a range of protocols also to make sure that we can hold those consultations in safe and inclusive environments. So that's something that we're planning. Most likely they will kick off from August this year. We had hope actually to start from June and July, but getting everything hooked up at the country level is taking a little bit of time. So we'll be making that more aware through our website and also at the country level as we plan that. Plus, something else that's quite interesting that we've just started last month in May, we've identified 11 projects across a range of countries where we're now doing what we're calling project affected people consultations. So we're going back to either ongoing projects or closed projects and meeting through focus groups and small participant interviews to discuss with people that have been directly affected by our projects to get their experiences and views so that we can take that into consideration. So yeah, a range of modalities. And we are looking to have a draft of the policy available by about September or October, which we'll make publicly available, and then we'll do further rounds of consultations. But the process will certainly be continuing into next year. March is the initial deadline that we've set to try and take the policy to the board, but actually our expectation is it may take longer. So if we need to spend some more time to complete consultations, we will add some more time.
Yeah.
But I should just comment briefly on the annual meeting question that you'd raised in the chat. Obviously, the situation in Sri Lanka is very, very challenging at the moment, and obviously concern for welfare of people in the country. Our Office of the Secretary is keeping that under close monitoring. I don't think there's been a final call at this stage around the annual meeting, which was scheduled for September, the second part of the annual meeting. But most likely, even in the scenario that it was to be able to go ahead, I think we'd be looking at quite a lot of sessions happening in a virtual situation. Oh, actually, my colleague is informing, I may not be up to date here. I'm just checking. One of my colleagues is telling me that things have been called off from Sri Lanka. So we'll get back to you and clarify that situation. Heidi, you may have more information.
Yes, Bruce.
So go.
Yes, I just received information late last week that it's going to be virtual for civil society, and it's going to be in September. And that's where it's going to be. We will go ahead and have the civil society engagement program, but it's going to be virtual. So the follow-up question we have from Midnight, Bruce, is about the countries that we would do consultation in, and have the countries been finalized, and if there's a way that Midnight and the community of LGBTQI groups can participate and help in that process and be involved in this.
Yeah, what we can do is in a few moments we can drop the list of the countries that's been proposed into the chat box so everyone can see that. And we're still working on the detailed agendas for those, because it will be customized in each country depending on the interest. So that's something that we'd be happy to do some outreach on, and to include some SOGIESC consultations in some of those countries. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Midnight, for raising some really interesting information that our colleagues may be and other participants may be interested in knowing. We have another questions about, actually it's a comment, but I think potentially can give opportunities for us to share some information about the process that ADB goes through for projects and how we evaluate SOGIESC issues. The comment said that thank you for the opportunity to attend the consultation. I think there should be a clear differentiation in this dialogue about the dual focus. On the one hand, how these issues are addressed and covered at the institutional ADB level, and how they are incorporated effectively in projects and investments. And on the second area is a set of matrix and a systems for appraising and screening projects that could be useful, just like the use of the gender categorization system. So those are the two areas. One is about assessing and evaluating how these issues are addressed at the institutional level and how they're incorporated in projects and investment. The other one is about what kind of screening and process we go through for categorizing or identifying the risk, the way the gender group identify the gender categories. Thank you. Would you like to make a comment on that, Bruce, or response to this?
Thank you. Let's also bring in some of the other team members on this that are working on some of the details. But yeah, I think the levels of consideration that you've just highlighted is absolutely the way that we're looking at it as well. There's an active discussion inside ADB around how can we take a more proactive approach to SOGIESC issues within ADB. So, of course, promotion of gender equality and social inclusion as part of ADB's Strategy 2030, that's important. Then what we're looking at ultimately in the context of these consultations is how we can take forward a framework for projects through a safeguards lens. So looking in the context of how can we ensure that our projects don't leave anyone worse off? How do we screen, assess, consult, integrate mitigation and management measures into the projects? So that's what we'd like to have come out of this process, with some clear policy language that will give us that framework. But then the next stage is the development of the implementation guidance. For the issues like screening and categorization that you've just mentioned, we are actually looking to revamp the screening and categorization process that we will have for ADB projects. Right now, we have a safeguard framework that covers just three main areas: environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous peoples safeguards. And in each one of those areas, we do a separate categorization based on the potential impacts and risks of the project to the environment or for people being resettled, etc. So that's done separately. What we're looking at in the future is a more integrated risk-based categorization process that will look at environment and social issues and how they interact. We will also have a range of safeguard standards, for example, covering labor and working conditions, or covering pollution prevention, or biodiversity, stakeholder consultation and engagement. On each of these standards, we will develop or update screening criteria, risk factors that we will look at, including the contextual risks, and that will all go into the screening and categorization process for projects. But that needs to be developed further, actually. So there's more work that will need to be done to look at the issues around SOGIESC and how that's factored into that process.
Thank you, Bruce. At this point, we don't have any more hands raised or questions in the chat box, so I encourage you to look. I would like to ask the presenter to show the slides again with the questions, so that we can be reminded of the questions in case there are participants who would like to ask some of the questions or would like to know some of the area listed here, or it would like to share any experience or call ADB's attention to any issue that you think we may have missed in the discussions, or share your thoughts at this point, please. We have a little bit more time to discuss today, and we do want to use all the time and really engage you in the discussion, because you may have some other issues that we may have overlooked in this presentation. I see there is a raised hand from Gochatan. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Gochatan Sandhu. I am the Director of Programs at ILGA World. ILGA, for those you know, is the LGBTI Federation. If it's okay, I don't have my camera on. I just wanted to point out one in terms of the intersectionalities of the various areas you looked at in terms of violence and harassment, policies and legislation, health and labor. One of the key things I think that we need to look at is, or ensure that they are not looked at in silos. It's very, very important. There's a group of, or there's not enough evidence, and there needs to be more evidence on this in looking at the enabling factors for each of those conditions. Let me give you an example. There was a great employment scheme launched by the Calcutta federal government in India to help trans people enter the labor market through providing them with training on working on the local metro/subway structure. After having completed the training, many of the beneficiaries or the targets of the training actually dropped out of the scheme. Why? Because they had to travel up to an hour and a half each day to get to work. And whilst traveling to work, they faced violence and harassment. So one of the key concerns is, great, you're providing them with employment and training, but if it's not matched with other factors such as good housing, ensuring safety and security on public transport, that scheme didn't work, and consequently many of them dropped out. It wasn't until that adequate housing was provided that many of them returned to that scheme. So I think it's very important that when we look at those two, or look at those priority areas, that they're not looked at in silo. Another point I would like to raise, and this is more from my previous role working in the UN system. I was the president of UN Globe, the LGBTI staff group of the UN system. One of the key challenges we had there was not just about training, but transforming the internal structure within the organization and across a huge system like the UN. And how do you do that? And I think one of the responsibilities also falls upon HR. One of the key things that I would often say is HR are the gatekeepers to letting the right people into the organization, and often letting the wrong people into the organization. I think competency-based testing falls short here, not asking the right questions when it comes to diversity and inclusion. You know, we have questions such as give an example of where you've worked with a diverse team are not sufficient anymore. I think those questions need to turn into more technical questions where, for example, your colleague has just made a homophobic or transphobic remark. What would you do in this situation? And what actions would you take? We need more concrete technical tools to actually back up those high-level policies, those ambitious asks that we're asking of ourselves, and how do you implement them? And really sort of drilling down on the nitty-gritty there as well, and coming up with more creative ways. So just some points there for you to take on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Good chat, and that's really, I think, goes to the heart of some of our social assessment work. So I like to call my colleague Madhumita Gupta into the discussion to share a little bit about the integrated assessments that we're currently looking at, and the current ADB system of the social assessments that's required for project development. Madhu, please.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks, Gurcharan, for this question and these suggestions and the feedback on a very project-specific case from my hometown. What I would do first is just trying to make a distinction between how ADB operates. First, the scope of the safeguard policy is limited to the adverse impacts that ADB has on people and environment. So basically, the policy provisions that you would see would actually deal with the negative impacts. But there's another aspect which also looks at the broad project design issues and how all of these issues that you mentioned to assess, go, beyond, providing employment opportunities, but to go beyond, providing, housing and other aspects. When we actually do a project, I'll just give you an example. The first process starts with an initial poverty social analysis, where we assess, what would be the impacts, who are the beneficiaries, what is the objective of the project, what kind of components we should design, what are the kind of barriers people have, what kind of involuntary resettlement impacts the project would have, the negative impacts. Are there any IP population in that project area? Will there be adverse environmental impacts? Will there be, laborers who, migrant laborers who would come to the area? Will there be differentiated gender impacts? So all of these questions, that kind of screening also happens for various social dimensions. Then also comes the process of a detailed analysis, which we call the poverty social analysis, which builds on a very wide stakeholder engagement plan. It talks to beneficiaries, people who are adversely affected, to ensure that we have the appropriate design of the project. And once we identify the kind of adverse impacts or the positive impacts, for example, sometimes, as you mentioned, some of the positive impacts can also be enhanced by adding some measures if we have the right kind of assessment. So we have a process. Currently, we are also trying to strengthen that process and ensure that all these issues of intersectionality, that you mentioned, can be also captured at that level, as well as when we come to the scope of the safeguard policy, we are also thinking of, as we already mentioned a couple of times, contextual risk assessment for SOGIESC issues, as well as, integrated assessment, how the social and environmental impacts, interplay and interact with each other, which are the population groups the most vulnerable from the negative impacts of the project, and what kind of measures are needed. So, as I explained when in my earlier response, that you screen, you categorize, you go into detailed social impact assessment and also environmental impact assessment. You see which are your population groups in the project area who are adversely affected, and then you also design measures to mitigate those impacts. It can relate to workers, it can be related to discrimination, it can be related to employment opportunities in ADB project construction. So from the safeguard perspective, you'll see resettlement plans, indigenous peoples plans, environmental management plans, all of that prepared. But from the proactive agenda, which I explained through the poverty social analysis process, they also have what they call social development action plan, gender action plan, which basically enhances the design of the project. So what I'm trying to say, yes, there are opportunities where we already have existing tools. What we really need to do is develop more guidance and tools for SOGIESC issues and see how through the entire project, ADB project cycle, we are able to incorporate, enhance the measures and ensure inclusion, as well as ensure that in our projects where there are adverse impacts, there is non-discrimination, there are grievance mechanisms available, and there are appropriate mitigation measures. For example, if somebody is losing housing land, there's an appropriate compensation measure. So this is how the entire system is working. But I would just like to emphasize, and I think somebody also commented that we should have different levels. So the SPS would focus more on the adverse impacts, but while at the same time, we are also planning, collaboration. We are planning development of knowledge on SOGIESC issues, because we understand that there is a huge amount that we need to work on to build awareness of our DMCs or executing agencies and implementing agencies. I'll stop there. I think it was a very, very long response. I'm sorry, Heidi. And thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you, Madhu, for your answer. I'd like to acknowledge Midnight's suggestion on advancing further LGBTQ in governments that are not LGBTQ friendly, and a whole host of other recommendations for us to take note of. Thank you, Midnight. We'll take note of your comments and record it. And also, if you would like to submit, in addition, any paper or anything like that, please do email it to us. You have our email address already. To address the questions on discrimination at the HR point and at the hiring side, I like to ask Tony Joe to talk broadly about what is usually the case and what are some of the mitigation measures, and then Director Bruce Dunn can come in later and share a bit on the ADB side. And I think my colleague Oliver Chapman would also like to add after Bruce. So go ahead, Tony Joe. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Gurshatan, for raising the important issue of human resources. In fact, so in our analysis, we consider first of all human resources as being kind of an important criteria in assessing SOGIESC integration within MFIs, and that's why we look into what our current present human resources that are specific to SOGIESC in each multilateral financial institution. And these are basically like, the World Bank has a SOGI global advisor, and that's great. And we want to advance that. But I think also your comment goes beyond that to ensure how do we kind of ensure that all staff within those institutions are, inclusive of LGBTI people. And that's a very important point. I will just say that, my knowledge is that some of the other MFIs that have also integrated SOGIESC policies have been struggling with, this issue, because a lot of the hirings, especially for country staff, happens. And sometimes people come with their existing beliefs that might be challenging to to LGBTI people. So how can an institution make sure that the right people are getting into the institution that can push this kind of work forward? So I'm just gonna kind of broadly say that some other institutions are also working on kind of some HR policies when it comes to hiring, how to ask for kind of to test potential new employees on their views and their kind of inclusive behavior. So this is something that also could potentially inspire this kind of work within human resources at the ADB and beyond. I'll stop here.
Okay, Bruce, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think Tony Jo's provided a pretty good perspective in terms of the HR, but I'll just briefly add, firstly, I think it's a really good question, and your example that you provided earlier to that point was really spot on. We do need to go beyond just broad-based questions around diversity to more specific questions based on a competency framework. Couple of things there from ADB side. Firstly, we do apply a competency-based framework to our recruitment, but the specific questions and the approach of HR is continuously under review, and it's actually something that I'd like to take forward and follow up after this consultation to check on this issue a little bit more. So I appreciated you raising it from that side. Another aspect is code of conduct. We do expect and hold all of our staff to a high level of code of conduct. So it's something actually that all of our staff need to reconfirm on an annual basis, their compliance with the code of conduct. And we've actually strengthened our organization, including a Office of Professional Conduct, which was established last year to really push forward on some of these issues. So that's another aspect. And then lastly, just going back to the earlier presentation, we also need to have specific expertise in the organization to be able to drive work on SOGIESC forward, which includes further work on internal development, HR practices, but also our entire program. And that's something that we're aware of and we'd like to work more on. So actually we do have plans at this stage which we're looking out to the future to be able to recruit so that we have expertise to support us in this area. And thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Oliver, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just put something in the chat just in case I'm on time. But yeah, just to say that I think, adding to what Bruce was saying, that the diversity, inclusion and belonging team have been in place for maybe a couple of years now. And this is exactly the sort of issue they're looking at. And I actually work closely with them because I'm also co-chair of the LGBT plus and Friends group, which is equivalent of Globe for ADB. But the kind of questions that you were mentioning, I think that's really interesting. And perhaps they're not fully aware of what's possible in terms of the LGBTQI sort of, in order to really ensure those kind of issues are dealt with in these kind of HR processes across the board. So I'll flag that to them, and if possible, I could maybe introduce you if that was all right, Gurchat, and just in case they have some further questions.
Thank you. I think the next question we have is a participant asking what is the answer to the first question that we posed here on the screen. Actually, the 5 questions we have on the screen is to stimulate your thinking, and we're asking you to give us the feedback on the discussion based on these 5 questions. So we're hoping that if you do have the responses or would you like to share with us answers to these questions, or these are what we are actually soliciting from you, the participants. So if you have any responses or any additional thinking or experiences that you would like to share with us that's relating to these 5 areas that we posted here, or more than this, or what we have not posted, please raise your hand and share with us. I think we're getting close to the time limit, but we do have time for a last call for questions or comments or any sharing that you would like to share with us at all this evening. Actually, for some of you may not be evening, but for me it's been a long day and it's the evening. So please let us know. I see Jaime said it's reassuring to hear the discussion here today. Thank you very much. Given the current understanding of gender in relations to the work that we do and our understandings of the gender categories in ADB, can we see any possibility for ADB to expand the concept of gender to include male, female, and others in line with global and DMC practices? Do you want to come in and expand on the question, Jaime? Have I covered everything?
Thank you, Heidi. I'm sorry I could not turn on my camera just to save on bandwidth. But yes,
It's okay, Jaime.
the work that we currently do, basically in relation to the gender categories, would give us a tendency to only look at women and girls. With a discussion going on now, can that mindset be expanded to include, as what I've said, male, female, and others in line with the DMC practices? For instance, in South Asia, we know that the third gender category is also shaping up really well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Jaime. We have our colleague here from the gender team. Can I ask my colleague Malika if she can address the expansion of a gender category to include SOGIESC as well? It's Malika?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. Yeah, as my colleagues mentioned, there are two types of work that we're doing in ADB: do no harm, which is covered by safeguard policy, and do good, which are covered by gender and development policy and our gender mainstreaming guidelines. It also provides guidance on how we do the gender mainstreaming and what needs to be included. So we are in discussion. We are working quite closely with our social development team and looking on how SOGI can fit within our operational priorities. The gender work looks mostly on women and girls and the impacts on women and girls, both in terms of our projects and our policy and technical assistance support. But what we look at, intersectionalities as well. So we're looking at women in all diversities, not just as a part of the vulnerable group, but also women as SOGI, as the person. Hope this clarified.
Thank you, Malika. We have a question here posed by Midnight on the projects that Bruce mentioned for review from SOGIESC lens, are also from the 11 countries, or are they different? Can I ask Bruce to address that?
Yes, thank you, Midnight. Yeah, the list of projects, which I'm also happy to share, covers some of the same countries, but it also has some additional countries as well. And it's actually a slightly separate process. We're going to be doing consultations with our developing member countries and with civil society, broadly to understand the implementation of the existing safeguards and then views on the new policy framework moving forward. But these project affected people consultations is really designed to hear directly from those affected peoples. Now, those projects specifically have not been identified to focus in on SOGIESC issues, but we are seeking to have a broad base of affected people involved in those consultations, and we're looking at sort of selection of participants and households, including through a vulnerability lens. It's an important issue though, so we're just actually doing the first couple on a pilot basis to look at lessons learned, and there's still some opportunities for us to revise and develop the methodology. So in terms of SOGI inclusion, that's actually something we can look at further. So thanks for raising that.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm looking to see, I think there's no more questions and no more comments in the comment box. It's time to actually wrap up, and we've used our time wisely. I think we had some really interesting discussion, and thank you very much for your engagement tonight. It's been very, very stimulating. I think there's a lot of interesting issues you've raised for us to consider. I'd like to hand over now to Azim to take us to the next part of the consultation. Azim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Dr. Tony Joe Lebos, Madhumita Gupta, Malika Shagozatova, and Bruce Dunn, as well as others I may have unintentionally missed. And of course, those from the events management and SEP teams working tirelessly behind the scenes. A warm and heartfelt thanks to all of you. But of course, a special and huge thanks to you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, some of which were very personal and intimate, and the constructive feedback and the way you engaged. I want to reiterate that the comments on SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific that are received from this consultation and thereafter will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating the safeguards policy statement. A further reminder that if you have not had an opportunity to pose your question or share your experience today, you can still do so by contacting us through the safeguards policy email update that's flashed on the screen now, or will be put in the chat box now. And a reminder that please don't go yet. On your screen, please give us your feedback about how you feel this consultation went and what your level of satisfaction is with today's session. Give us a rank of between 1 and 5, 5 being the most satisfied, 1 being the least satisfied, and of course, anything in between. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, this poll is absolutely anonymous. What we're most interested in is how well the session responded to your needs and addressed your issues and concerns, and overall, how satisfied were you with today's engagement? So if you could please do that now, just tap it into your keyboard or on your device. We'd like to relay the results of that survey back to you in the next 30 to 60 seconds. There are 2 additional polls whose links appear in the chat box now. One is a post-event feedback survey, which essentially asks a number of questions ranging from what you thought the consultation would be about to what it actually was about. So what were your initial expectations, and did the ADB meet, match, or exceed those expectations, or fall below them? And if falling below, why? We'd love to hear back from you so that we can strengthen future engagements and consultations with you. The second poll is a menti.com poll, and it asks the question to, in relation to the 1 to 5 Zoom poll survey, how specifically such consultations can be improved. If you have specific ideas on how the ADB can improve your level of satisfaction, please send us 3, 4, or 5 sentences, write as many words as you wish to on the menti.com link that is in the chat box now. And as I mentioned previously, you have up to a day to do that. We'd love to hear from you. If you have some thoughts now, that would also be great. So before we go, and before I turn back to Director Bruce Dunn, I'd like to read you the results of the Zoom poll survey. So if you haven't done so, tap in a number between 1 and 5. Here we have almost 92% have said that you're either highly satisfied or somewhat satisfied. The bulk of people have said that they were somewhat satisfied, which gives us considerable opportunity for improvement. We would like to know how specifically these consultations can be improved so that future engagements would take notice of the lessons learned from this consultation. So please share your opinions, your lessons, and your feedback with us so that future consultations can be even more engaging, more productive, and respond to your needs even better. With that, I'd now like to bring you back to the Director of SDCC, Bruce Dunn, a Director of SDCC, Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard from you and walk us through the next steps after this consultation. Bruce, could you please review the discussions and our next steps?
Okay, thank you very much, Azim, and a huge thanks to everyone that's joined today. I found the list of issues that have been highlighted to be really pertinent, stimulating for us. Obviously, there's still a lot of issues at this stage for us to consider in terms of the development of sort of ADB's more proactive approach on SOGIESC issues, as well as for this safeguard policy update and how we can implement safeguards effectively. So I really appreciated the issues. I'll try and provide just a very brief summary of some of the key points that I've noted down from the consultation. I've got about 10 points, but there's obviously more than that in this session, so I apologize if I'm not able to cover everything. We are, though, making a record of these sessions, and we'll be making a summary that attempts to provide a fuller listing of all the key issues. And as Azim has said, we will be taking the key recommendations into our further internal discussions. It's going to feed into the policy update itself. And of course, once we have the draft policy available, we'll go out for further consultation. So yeah, your inputs will have a direct bearing on the final outcome of the process. Okay, so just moving to a quick summary. So firstly, I think we heard from some of you very explicitly, and I think all of you one way or the other, on the need for ADB to have a strong safeguard on SOGIESC. Secondly, we of course need to look very carefully at how we can advance and further LGBTQI issues with governments, including those that are not friendly to the agenda. And of course, civil society represented in this call today are also interested in having being part of that dialogue as well. Next, I think we heard very clearly from a number of you around the need for an integrated approach, one that looks at contextual risks and vulnerabilities, including at the country levels and also sector levels. There was other points around this that we need to make sure that we don't have a siloed approach in terms of our understanding of the risks, but also in the way that we develop projects. You have to look holistically at a range of environmental and social issues and how those relate to the final design. And of course, stakeholder engagement is going to be very critical in that process as well. And for the stakeholder engagement, I think we heard very clearly, one is the need for an inclusive approach to these consultations that we're now doing for the policy update, but also, of course, as we move forward to the actual policy implementation, we need to make sure that it's inclusive and of course, safe. It hasn't come up so much in this consultation today, but certainly in other consultations that we've done for this policy update, risks around retaliation of people involved in consultation processes has certainly come up, and that's certainly an issue that we're aware of, sensitive to, and I think in certain countries where there may be legal barriers, criminality or even persecution, that's an obvious issue that we need to be very sensitive for. Next, I was talking before about the need for an integrated approach, and of course, intersectionality is a key issue there. The relationships between SOGIESC issues and other types of vulnerability or disadvantage in society are obviously clear elements as well. Next, I think we had a clear recommendation that ADB needs to look not just at this project level, but also at the institutional level in terms of gender and inclusion that integrates the SOGIESC issues as part of our framework, and also that moves forward institutional level to project level, and then clear details on implementation arrangements. And we spoke briefly there about screening and categorization processes and how that needs to be integrated as well. Another point was on linkage and support for strengthening human rights systems and reporting processes. That was seen as being very important, and for opportunities to work with the UN system as well as with civil society in terms of understanding the contextual risks in a country and shadow reports that could inform our understanding of that process as well. Another issue was in terms of HR policies, the need to make sure that those are strengthened for greater diversity and inclusion with specific competency-based questions in recruitment. And of course, for ADB as well, we need to strengthen our expertise specifically for SOGIESC issues. And then lastly, I would just want to mention around collaboration with partners. We do all appreciate the information gaps as well as the implementation challenges. You know, many of you, of course, here, all of you, I should say, are here because you're committed to these issues. You're working in country or you're working at the regional level. You have studies, you have data. There's interest in partnerships, and that's something that we're interested in as well, and we'd be very keen to collaborate moving forward. So again, look, thank you. It's been a rich harvest. I've really only touched on a small number of the issues that were raised today, but really appreciated it. And then finally, I'll just mention on next steps. We are undertaking further consultations this week on the SOGIESC topic. We'll be running another session tomorrow focusing on the East Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and then we'll do one tomorrow evening, well, evening Manila time, but it will be targeting stakeholders in Europe and North America. So of course, if anyone's interested to join again those sessions or share information to other colleagues, we'd very much welcome that. We will be then holding a couple of other consultations in this regional consultation series, which will look at how we're applying safeguards for financing modalities and for the private sector. We're actually expecting to do those consultations later this month, but we are still working on some of the background studies. So unfortunately, we've just decided we'll need to postpone those sessions until probably August. So if anyone was planning to take part in those, you'll be having further information from us soon on the rescheduling of those events. And then, as mentioned during the consultation, we're also now planning for follow-up country consultations as well as the project affected people's consultations. And we did drop into the chat box, if you haven't seen, the list of countries and the list of projects that we'll be focusing on. So it's still a lot of work for us to do in terms of further studies, listening to stakeholders, and then we're taking that forward into the policy drafting. So again, I just can't thank you enough for joining us today. Really appreciate your support. And until next time we have a chance to catch up, please stay safe and well. Thank you again.